which is through the recent years, we had sometimes I used directors, the opinion polls. The concept is that these polls express the public, and that the political leadership takes what is coming from these polls, and so they have programs, the leaders, and they have the freedom to make a decision, and there is a lot. So here, who has the ability to make the decision? And so we listen many times to a majority of the leadership, and they don't give a position. These are the conclusions. The paper speaks about the issues related to this conference, like how the public agreed with the Palestinian leadership about the reasons for the staggering or failure of the national project. The poll shows that 36% blame Israel for the failure of the national project. And as what happened in the, what was said in the interviews that I made with the first level leadership, first Israel, then the international community, and third, the internal Palestinian situation. And if we see in the polls, I don't know if it's clear over there, 27% they blame them, the Palestinians themselves, divided as follows. 11%, the Palestinian Authority did not succeed in building organizations and combating corruption. Fatah movement was unilateral, 9%. Making decision, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they did bombings that resulted in blocking the political action, which is 6%, and the second Intifada is 2%, along with the bombings. As I said, the factions agreed on this distribution as follows. Then the international community and then the Palestinians in general, with the different issues addressed since 25 years until now. The understanding of the national project, how the national factions understand it. The basic principles for the Palestinian factions, basic principles are the same or clear. That ending the Zionist occupation to the Palestinian territories of 1948, not only 67, but since 1974, this changed. This has changed, or the political programs changed. The texts, the basic text never changed, but the political understanding of the national project changed. And now it has 3 pillars as mentioned in the last statement of the National Council, ending the 1967 occupation and having a just solution for the issues of refugees, the first of which is 194 resolution. The national project that the National Council or the PLO speaks of, people or the factions were divided into different parts. There was not even agreement on the nature of the national project since 1947 about the nature of the national project. Fatah, Democracy, Mubadara, and People's Party, they agree that the existing national project is what is mentioned in the statement of the National Council, that is establishing the Palestinian state and ending the Israeli occupation of 1967, West Bank and Gaza, and the right of refugees to return This has become the project, whereas the Popular Front says this is a transitional solution. Same thing applies to Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the recent documents. The position, I'm running fast because Dr. Ghassan is pressuring me. The position on the one state, the Palestinian factions, they do not see the one state, although the basic, principles that democratic state of Palestine for all Palestinians in West Bank, Gaza, and 48. But the challenging question about the one state that is to merge with Israel. And here when you ask the Palestinian public today, with its current meaning today, then their position will be different, totally different. Saying one state and to merge with Israel, and so the Palestinian struggle will be part of struggle against apartheid and for social, economic, equal rights for the Palestinians. At the same time, the public, as the minimum of the two-state solution. In the recent poll, a few days ago, 62 of the Palestinian people, they say they do not support the two-state solution because they don't see possibility for this two-state solution as Israel has undermined that. 47% before that in June, in the poll before that in June, it said they supported the two-state solution, and 50% the two-state solution. 31% of those who oppose the two-state solution, they support the one-state solution. Majority, 56% of the public, they say the two-state solution is not a practical solution anymore. It goes up to 63% among the youths, which means 2/3 of youths of age 18 to 22 compared to 54 for those who are above the age 50 years of age. Now, in Fatah, 49% of their supporters, they say the two-state solution is not a just solution anymore. For Hamas, it's 73%. The other blocs, 42%. When I asked the leadership of the Palestinian factions, the two-state solution, it is the possible one that enjoys the international legitimacy, if you wish. And in the discussion that it was not realistic and to stick to the international incubation support. The Democratic Front and others, they rejected the two-state solution because it's connected to the colonialism and rejecting to change struggle to other fields. Al-Mubadara says, if the two-state solution fails, then we will go to the one state, which means that there is no Palestinian belief so far in the one-state solution. The form of the struggle, a future Palestinian struggle, how the Palestinian factions, they see it. Yes, 2/3 of the Palestinian public, they support popular struggle, but we don't see this on the ground by the Palestinian public. When we see people where they are going, we find a majority of the Palestinian people who say armed struggle, but Palestinian factions.
For this conflict to be reflected with the Palestinian factions, everybody talks about maintaining the right of the Palestinian people to resistance in accordance with international law, but we do not see today, we see it that it's only a theoretical discourse rather than actual orientation. Neither those who want armed resistance are engaged in armed resistance, nor those who want a popular, peaceful resistance are doing that. There is no real will among Palestinian factions to take one option or the other. It's true that there are attacks here and there, sometimes armed or popular resistance movements in some other cases, but the status of Palestinian struggle and resistance as a collective does not exist, and some people say there is no political will for that. And why do we talk about here theoretical discourse rather than anything else? Because the Palestinian factions should not be waiting for permission from the leadership. They should act if they wanted to. And so also in terms of international solidarity, which we will be addressing in the next session, the mechanisms are not there. We support BDS, but how do we support BDS? How do we achieve successes there? I don't believe that there is a clear idea as to how to do that. Some people say that we need to engage in the international solidarity movement and the struggle movement against global imperialism. But what are the tools, what are the instruments? Is it possible to do that? And what is suggested in this regard? And that is what is more important in terms of strengthening international solidarity as well as our Arab environment. And I asked the factions about the individual attacks or operations. There was more analysis rather than a position. We can understand the sociological and psychological reasons that lead to these attacks, the lone fighters, and that it is as a result of the lack of confidence and the division, and that we see this as the tip of iceberg because there's a lot of anger among young people. These are probably true statements, but how can we translate these lone individual operations to one form of organized resistance, as in other words, to frame the Palestinian popular resistance, the youth staying away from factions. There are no instruments to revive these factions or frameworks for bringing attracting youth as in the past, despite the fact that there's high levels of politicization among students in universities. When we go to the elections at Birzeit University, we see that independents do not succeed in any elections, or that it is very rare for anybody who is not running under for a Palestinian faction that would win, because there's a high level of politicization. But what is more important is how to reorganize these young people within the context of factions, because 1.5% only of young Palestinians joined Palestinian factions in 2015, according to one survey. If we conducted the same survey today, I think the percentage would be less. Even in terms of volunteering work, the young people percentage engaged in that is very minimal, and how to re-engage them in volunteering work is another question, because young people are the main actors, supposedly. If you go to prisons, you see most of the prisoners are from the youth. If you see popular resistance, you will see the same, although all the actions that require efforts, you see young people figuring highly as people who are engaged in that. And this requires regrouping, re-engagement, reframing, reorganization of this. The position of the PLO, I think after the establishment of the PA, there are main and secondary contradictions, some that has to do with the social aspects that relate to the lives of people. For example, we see today a failure of the Palestinian authorities' economic policies over the past years, and we see the levels of poverty that is increasing among Palestinians, unemployment rates, but there are no political programs to address that. When we address the question of social welfare, most of the people or the Palestinian factions support the idea of a social welfare system. But if we go to their supporters of Palestinian factions, there is a slide about the positions of those people who are supportive of Palestinian factions. The PFLP, 3% only of its members said that they would support the implementation or the enforcement of the law today. I said that 3% of PFLP supporters said we want to apply the law or enforce the law today. Fatah, 12%, Islamic Jihad, 9%. For the People's Party, 69% of the supporters refused the enforcement of the law, and 63% of PFLP supporters, and 68% of Fatah, and 36% of Islamic Jihad. Their supporters said, I don't know, or they refused. But the Palestinian faction said in all their statements they supported the law. In their statements, in their discussions in the Palestinian Legislative Council, but the statement of the Fatah Revolutionary Council came after the people's position, because they saw that either there will be an explosion or that we will follow the masses that are on the streets that refuse the enforcement of this law. And therefore the Palestinian faction said, let's enforce the law with amendments, because the amendments are like based on true demands. The position on suspending agreements with Israel, all the Palestinian factions thought that this decision was not serious. And the Palestinian public, 76% of the Palestinian public said that this was not a true position or a serious position. There is alignment between the factions and the public's position in this regard, that the decision regarding suspending agreements with Israel is not serious and requires a lot of efforts in order to really take the decision to implement it. The main conclusion, I said it in the beginning, that the tools of change, the main tools of change since the Palestinian factions are the ones that affect and have impact on the Palestinian political thinking. The weaker the Palestinian factions, the weaker the national ideas and thinking and liberation project, and the stronger they become, the more the national project becomes closer to reach. But we are waiting for a new framework or a new explosion, maybe, for bringing about the change even in the composition of the factions constituting the PLO. Thank you, Jihad. Thank you for sticking to the time allowed, and thank you for your paper that it was clear that it was based on a lot of preparation and efforts. And we hope that it will be the subject of a lot of discussions after we finish with the other presentations. The second speaker is Mahmoud Ziyadeh, and the title of his paper is Protecting the Dignity and Rights of the Poor and the Marginalized, a Criterion for the Meaning and the Future of Democracy and the National Project. Here we're talking about the link or the relation between the respect and the realization of the rights and the dignity of the poor and the marginalized and the worker, and the democratic structure and the ability of the society to realize its objectives. Mahmoud Ziyadeh is a union activist, and he is a person very well known at the national level. He struggled a lot, he made a lot of sacrifices, and he's also an activist in the social sphere. He exerted a lot of efforts in terms of union activism, and he is the Secretary General of independent trade unions. Mr. Mahmoud, you have 15 to 20 minutes. You have the floor. The main idea in terms of trying to discuss, or what the presentation attempts in bringing about the discussion in terms of the main conflict with the colonization, the struggle, the internal struggle, and all the internal struggles, or the struggle with the capitalism continues because we're under colonization. It remains a secondary struggle regardless of what the capital owners or does, or the role of capital in the struggle against colonization or for emancipation from the colonization. We are partners with the capitalists, or we need to have more discussion. It appears to me that this is something very important now and later and beyond. When we fight colonization and post-colonization, because all the people who were emancipated from colonization in the region found that themselves in a more authoritarian regimes that is worse than colonization even. So we have to discuss that. Is this a law that you first finish with external colonization to pave the way for internal despotism? Is it the law of things, or can we get rid of both at the same time? And this is what I'm trying to do in terms of the discussion. And let's maybe think and see, maybe it will work out for us in a different manner. Before that, or before I delve into this, I want to do a simple and concentrated analysis of the position of capital and from the question of social welfare as a basis for strengthening sumud or steadfastness, in addition to its other idea that it will construct or build a society. What did the private sector say regarding social welfare and social protection? First, they've said there is no need, there's no importance for social welfare or social protection for those who do not work in principle, people who are unable to find jobs, women, those who work at home, or anybody who is poor, or persons with disabilities, and so on and so forth. There is no need for them to have social welfare. In terms of social welfare that was discussed since 2003 until this day, the idea is limited within the existence of a regime that is based on contributions and from the workers and the employers, but for whose purpose? In the private sector original idea, they thought this should be based on a system that is established and managed by the private sector as a for-profit company. Otherwise, then we will not accept it. And the private sector, we are the ones who have the capital, and these are our workers, and this is our money, and we will invest them. And the government is not functioning, and the public sector, they are dysfunctional, and they cannot be trusted to do anything. Look at what they did in terms of the law for retirement and retired people, and they have a lot of debt. So do you want to give them a social welfare trust fund and they will not manage it or mismanage it? There are no guarantees if you want social welfare except through a for-profit company that is established and managed by the private sector. That's their argument. When that required a law, they lobbied the government, and the government was forced to issue regulations in 2010 that was called the bylaws or regulations, executive regulations that allowed the private sector to establish a company to have a system of social welfare, and they called it the non-government retirement fund. The private sector, they are smart. They saw that there were problems in that, legal problems in that, so they went to the social welfare law. So they sneaked around using the law in order to get to a non-government retirement fund, which in the social welfare law was termed as the complementary system or supplementary system. This is what happened in 2016. Many people, including targeted workers, by the supplementary system. The main idea of it is to take the funds that are saved from a saving fund from establishments that have such provident fund, for example, benefits and the severance pay, and take all that money from the different companies and put them in this company and transfer the deductions on a monthly basis to this fund. And the private sector was not had not problem to pay accumulating severance pays and to make the deductions and transfer the deductions, and up to 12%, because this is a fund that they will manage and that they will operate. And for them, they didn't mind to do that. But this did not work for the people, and the people protested against it. The supplementary system failed. There were amendments to this law. The private sector did not want to move one bit in terms of its contributions to this fund. They remained the same. Those payout that you deserve, we will send them to this fund on a monthly basis. Other than that, we don't have nothing to offer you. But they did not want to do that, and according to the amendments that took place to the social welfare law, the fund is running a deficit even before it starts, because they don't want to pay anything. If a fund that gives more benefits to those who deserve these benefits without contributions, then this is a fund that will run a deficit even before it starts. It will start with a deficit, but then they went back to the first premise, and that is either a social welfare law or retirement fund that we have and we own and we manage, and otherwise there's nothing that we can offer you. So this is the story of the social welfare law. In the context, though, we have to say what, in addition to the absolute rejection of the private sector to contribute to the social protection fund, this is the philosophy of the social welfare fund, that there is a society, that everybody comes together, that we manage the risks together, that we manage the struggle against the colonization together, and manage our internal affairs and problems together. Share the responsibility, share the concerns. How do we share that? By redistribution of the responsibilities and the burden, redistribution of wealth, resources, and if there are responsibilities, people share them. The private sector says, this does not work, this does not fly. Social justice and dignity, as well as steadfastness, in accordance to the following. That's from the perspective of the private sector. Social welfare system that we establish, we manage and achieve profits to serve our idea or our thinking. Secondly, the question of freedoms, that people speak, discuss, contribute. How do societies manage their affairs? People engage in dialogue. What is the idea of the private sector in terms of this dialogue? For the private sector, dialogue does not work for them. The private sector refuses the principle of dialogue. Somebody says, might wonder, am I being fair or not? No, but do surveys, do look at the largest companies that the private sector is running. It is forbidden, not forbidden for people to discuss. People are not allowed to cough or utter one word. This is the law in the private sector. This is private sector that wants only profits, and they only are fierce and relentless, and they care less about others. And the principle of the freedom of expression, democracy, doesn't it mean for people to exchange their opinions and ideas, express their concerns, their problems, their aspirations? In the private sector law, this is forbidden. It's true that there are the PLO, the PA, the government are to be blamed, and there is a lot that was said in this regard, and it was all true. But we need to reflect on the relationship between the private sector and the regime. I don't know, it seems the private sector is also controlling the political regime and is directing the political regime and imposing their will on them. In 2003, 2005, 2007, 2010, 2014, and 2018, that was the case. The private sector imposed its thinking, and if they are upset, the government says, no, we will do whatever the private sector wants. The labor law. 75% of the people working in the private sector, the labor law does not apply to them. It means that they are not allowed or entitled to holidays, vacations, or the minimum wage, and a large percentage of them do not get even the minimum wage. This is the vision of the private sector. This is the dignity, this is the justice, and this is the freedom, and this is the democracy, according to them. You all probably were aware that the telecommunication companies do not accept. For the last 2-3 years, we were calling and saying that these prices are not good for the people. People cannot afford them, but they tell us these are the best prices and the best services. You like it or you don't, that's what you're gonna get. That's the response. After all of what I just described, is the struggle secondary? And exploitation and undermining dignity and prohibition of freedom of expression. Thus the struggle remains secondary and should be postponed until we finish with the colonization. So regardless of how dangerous this is or what they are doing, and yet it remains a secondary struggle, or because it is called Palestinian private sector, so undermining and exploitation and forced work. Is it because from Palestinians, is it okay and we need to accept it? We shouldn't. It seems to me, and this is something for thinking and reflection, that maybe since the PLO, particularly among the left-wing factions, they kept telling us they postponed the struggle. This is not the main struggle. The main struggle is to finish with colonization. I don't say that emancipation from colonization is a main struggle, but when the private sector is worse than colonization, do we still consider it a secondary struggle and that these are our Palestinian people and they are good? It doesn't look like it. I don't believe it's true. Even among people, I don't know if some people hear about the people who are crushed, who are suffering as a result of the private sector practices and what they say about the private sector. They don't care whether the name of the private sector is Living Moshe or Muhammad, all of them, if they are going to undermine the dignity of the people, we don't want them. We don't want this despotism, this authoritarianism, neither from the private sector nor from the colonization. We are before two struggles. Dignity cannot be divided, neither under colonization or post-colonization. The private sector is establishing policies and laws, and they continue with their path for profit. And if somebody says or protests, they say that priority is to the deal of the century and ending the division. Is it true? Do we believe them that they want to resist the deal of the century as they become the national capital or private sector, that they did not go to the Bahrain workshop conference, that they refuse to go, that this is nationalism, that this is their struggle? It doesn't mean anything. Or their position on security coordination, they said it very clearly and without any hesitation that no work for private sector can take place without security coordination, more than the security coordination that the government is engaged in or the security agencies are engaged in. So now they are doing a system of security coordination of a new form and they have control from Beit El offices and the Israelis directly on the transportation of their goods. They have also surveillance of their factories and their companies wherever they are. So they say without security coordination, our work does not happen. And the security coordination is very important for economy and for its prosperity in order to achieve social justice and dignity. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mahmoud. Mahmoud did not disappoint me because he, instead of giving a lecture, he threw a bomb that relates to what we all need to be aware of in terms of the relationship between what is the social and class struggle on the one side and what is a national struggle, because as Mahmoud said, it is a topic that requires more focus and concentration and more courage to address these issues. We now move to the third presentation that will be presented by the advisor, Councillor Ali Mhanna, which talks about the decline in the role of trade unionism in Palestine, causes and prospects within the framework of the national project renewal. Mr. Ali Mhanna is the advisor to the President on Legal Affairs and has worked in the past as Minister of Justice and worked in the past as a chairperson of the Higher Judicial Council, and before that was the head of the Palestinian Bar Association. Mr. Ali, you have 15 to 20 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. To start with, allow me to thank Bir Zayt University that made us used to seeing it in the front line, and to thank those, the organizers of this activity, allowing me this opportunity to avail myself this opportunity to speak to you on the issue of unions. And I thank my friend Dr. Democratisation, who has had an important role in organizing this activity. But the subject of my paper, the decline in the role of the trade unionism in Palestine, causes and prospects within the framework of the national project renewal, I'll start addressing those of age who witnessed the rise of unions, that is, in the stage before the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority. The unions were the leaders for the national activism, and their compound or their headquarters was the leadership, because unions is an organized large framework that can affect activity through activism and through its members. the engineers, the bar association, the doctors union, the agricultural engineers, the veterinarians, the dentists. All of them were under the professional unions compound, and they had an important leading role in confronting with the Israeli occupation, as a result of which many of the professionals were arrested and many of them were under house arrest, such as engineer Ibrahim Daqqaq and Jamil Nasser Uthman and many other such leaders. Why this role was important, why it had an effect? Because this was one of the tools for the Palestinian national struggle, one of the experiences, like the experience of the municipalities. When we had the municipal elections in the 70s, it was one of the tools for expressing the Palestinian national struggle, which produced a number of leaderships, including our dear friend who is sitting here, Mr. Abdel Jawad Saleh, then Karim Khalaf, and Sam Shak'a. God bless their souls. They had an experience. Now, why do we say there is a decline in the role of the trade unionism? First, let's see if there is a decline or not. I believe measuring a decline, if any, this should take into consideration the nature of the circumstances and the time. I believe there is a decline. There is a decline. There is a tangible decline. Why? Because usually unions, they have two roles. One that is public, and the other one has to do with demands. The public one, before the Palestinian Authority, the unions had an important role. Currently, there is a decline on this role. Even on their unionist demands, there is a little bit decline on both sides, the public and the unionist one. Why? Why is that decline? Here, when we say unions, we speak in general. This includes all the unions, the popular unions as well. Yes, there is an issue that we keep repeating all the time, which is the nature of the Palestinian speciality in the Palestinian context. And I am not using this as a pretext for our failure, if any, but I'm speaking about the speciality of the experience, significance, and the speciality of different nations. The construction struggle started after the liberation. That's why they used to say, you place the first stone on the footsteps after the last footstep of the last occupier. But here we are building before we finish the liberation, or maybe we have not liberated. Under the occupation and the battle of construction, there is a contradiction between occupation and construction. Every time you want to build, the occupation will demolish. Also, the liberation and construction tools, they do not meet. The liberation is the militias, is the factions and demonstrations, whereas the building is the rule of law, judicial independence, public liberties. How can both of these meet? If the factions are the main tool, per se, for liberation, then they will have arms. So in the rule of law, you shouldn't have arms. So naturally, there will be a contradiction between the tools for liberation and for construction. So this speciality has reflected itself on all walks of life in the Palestinian life and all experiences, including that of the unions. Why? Because this experience that brought together the battle of liberation and construction has confused the unions. First, they knew what was their priority. It was facing the occupation in the public aspect, not on the demand or unionist one. On the demands or unionist one, it was more of a public one as well. That's why currently, after the battle was or included the construction or the building one, it couldn't, the unionism couldn't prioritize its actions. If they are working on their demands, who they will be facing? Will they be facing the private sector, as Mr. Mahmoud said, or the public sector represented by the Palestinian Authority? Now, where is the public side? So this issue has confused the unionism and led to the decline of its role. The second one, which is important, another factor for their decline, is the return of the Palestinian factions to the homeland. In the past, the unions were the forefront for political action because they had that form of public legitimacy, whereas the factions were prohibited. So all factions, Fatah, the Democratic Front and others, they had the interest of being within the union so that they can confront the occupation, because they didn't have any action on the ground, but rather underground or through the unionism. Otherwise, they would be arrested or deported for a long period of time. So the return of factions to the homeland presented the presence of the original instead of the proxy one through the unions. The factions, they wanted now to take up their political role within the public and the masses. And so they didn't need that proxy or the unions, a matter that weakened the unions and made them retreat back to their demands or unionists and to the semi-public instead of the direct public one. This is one of the reasons. Another factor the third factor is the references. We have the Palestinian unions. They have different legal references. In the West Bank, their legal reference is the former Jordanian laws that were in place before 1967. And in Gaza, the Palestinian laws were the Egyptian laws that were there. Whereas the unions that were following the PLO were based on the references of the PLO. So we have a number of references. And these are, very old. Some of them are outdated. Some of the legal references date back to the 30s. The penal code in Gaza is 74 of the year 1936. And here the penal code is from the 60s. Same thing, you're speaking about a law that is the revolutionary law of 1979. So you are speaking about the multiplicity of the legal framework. So every union has a different legal framework, and at the same time, all the legal laws, they cannot meet the requirements for modernization and to cope up with the current developments. A matter that has led to the weakening of the unionism. Another reason for the decline is the Palestinization of the unions. Although in spite of around 25 years of the age of the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian unions, especially the professional ones that have laws in Beit Hanina, their majority they depend on Jordanian, not Palestinian laws. We hear about the dentists, the engineers unions. Many of them are branches or offices for Jordanian unions, and they still apply the laws that are before the laws that existed before 1967, because they cannot apply any amendments to these very laws in Jordan. So the only union is the Bar Association. Because from the start we went to the Palestinian Legislative Council and we created a Palestinian law. This issue has been discussed more than once, that it should be considered as a priority to nationalize these unions so that you can have legal frameworks can serve the needs of the Palestinian needs for the Palestinian context of these unions. Another reason, which is related to the return of the factions, the attempts of the political factions to enter the unions as an expression of presence. So they need to be in the union. This has damaged a lot. In the past, we had that factional thought before the occupation. All the factions wanted to have some factional formation or presence or structure within the unions. When they returned, now they are more adamant or determined to show or for the visibility of these factions within the unions. So what to do in facing this situation? First of all, we need to go for the unification of unions. We cannot accept having different unions for one sector, saying this union is for Democratic Front and this one is for Fatah and this one is for Mr. X and that one for Mr. X. We need to have a legal framework for unifying these. So for laborers to have one union, for doctors, same thing. But this multiplicity and parallelism, it weakens the unionist action. Also, as we said in the past, to reactivate the issue of unions, that is to develop the front activism.
Unfortunately, now most of the factions are now working on without a collective vision. We don't see lists within union elections that have the idea of the collective, and if there are coalitions or alliances, there are only among two factions in the best case scenario. There was an idea to have lists within the union, like the idea of the general elections, meaning that all the factions know how much they will get as a list or as a faction represented within the union. This gives the possibility of taking stock of all the experiences of the different factions. If we do not focus on reorganizing our priorities within unions, the decline in the role of the unions are now not able to concentrate. What should they focus on the public activism or the demands-driven work? Is it for demands against the private sector or the public affairs, meaning confronting the government? And this requires, in rearranging the priorities of the union work, it should take into consideration the specificity of the Palestinian situation, because we don't have unionism like it used to be in the past, nor is it having the same priorities as before. The role of unions should be strengthened in the process of building in all its forms, and that in the private in the public sphere, they should focus on fighting the occupation. Thank you, Mr. Ali Mohanna. This is an important presentation that shed light on the reasons behind the decline in unionism in Palestine, with the focus on trade unions. One of the reasons of why I was being strict on terms of time is that in this session, we are not only lucky that we have distinguished panelists, from, as you've noticed from their presentation, but because also we have distinguished audience. We have a number of distinguished professors and distinguished students and community leaders and political leaders, and therefore I wanted that to keep sufficient time for discussion. I open the floor now for discussion and for comments, so that each comment or question does not exceed 2 minutes, to allow the largest number of the audience to engage in the discussion. Abdullah Abu Eid, a retired law professor. I thank the three panelists for their presentations, regardless of my disagreement with some of the opinions, yet they are very important presentations. The things that Dr. J had that talked about the information about the public shows that more than 30% of the regular Palestinian citizens support the one-state solution. Israel wants to get rid of its Arab citizens and the Palestinians in Jerusalem. The Zionist movement, even the politicians, maybe 40% of the politicians don't know the core and essence of the strategy of Zionism, because they very smartly, they are carrying out tactics. Sometimes they are attractive, these tactics, but the strategies are hidden and they are implementing them. I taught the Palestinian question 15 years. I taught for 1 year the Israeli Zionist movement and the Israeli regime. And I taught the Israeli-Arab conflict in at Pennsylvania University. I found out that very few people know about the core essence of the Zionist movement. Let me give you an idea about their strategy. The Mapam leader that in the 50s had only a few members and now only 1 member. So it is a Zionist, a communist party that later became the Meretz party. And Simhan Lavin said in his book, The Birth of Israel Myth, and he says, one of the leaders asked Ben Gurion, President Ben Gurion, how do you recognize the 1967 borders or the partition borders? And the West Bank, Ben Gurion said, the West Bank will not run away, we will catch it later. So the right and the left Zionist parties think similarly one way or the other. Do you think that the people that you have been surveyed, are they aware of these this information? Abu Saleh, you have the microphone.
شكرا.
Thank you.
يعني أنا بدي أكون
I want to be like Mahmoud, and
تحكوا عن مشروع وطني.
you talk about a national project. Do we have a national project? Security coordination. With security coordination, can we really talk about national project? It is not nice that you are trying to promote a national project. The national project that we want is ending the occupation. And Mahmoud, the private sector did not go to Bahrain, not because they boycotted the Bahrain conference, because the points have already been implemented that were discussed in the Bahrain conference. If you think of Jerusalem, if you think of the Berlin Abu Mazen plan, it negated the right of return, the right of borders, or the right of Jerusalemites, or the resistance of settlements, and they considered settlements as legitimate in terms of land swap basis. In terms of the borders, they recognized the cantons, and later on with Israel's control over the borders completely. There's nothing that they should go to Bahrain to discuss because it's already implemented.
The next speaker, kindly mention your name and your affiliation, so for the record. Mr. Amin Annabi. Thank you.
يعطيكم العافية. أنا مضبوط ملاحظة سريعة بس.
Short comment for Mr. Jihad. The descriptive case, Mr. Jihad, in your paper is extremely important. But part of the paper, this is a suggestion for you, if you can develop a paper later on, that we were in a crisis as political factions. So there were several attempts to formulate frameworks, be it leftist union, democratic union. This should be part of the descriptive case. How we started and why did it fail? Because the decline in the programs of the political factions has resulted into the formation of a number of blocks, be the leftist bloc, the democratic bloc. So this should have been mentioned. Thank you. Mr. Engineer Atif Maidani. For all researchers and politicians who are demanding for cancelling agreements with the Israeli side, I believe this is more of a propaganda because to tell us what is the next step. If Abu Mazen cancelled, this is a populist discourse, because if Abu Mazen decides to cancel these agreements, are we ready for the next day? I believe this is a populist discourse because all the factions are part of the executive. They have their ministers and they are saying this to achieve some political gains, nothing more. My question to Mr. Mahmoud about the labor law and the welfare law. I am in the country since 25 years. I never heard about a union that called for a Congress meeting at their General Congress meeting to discuss general issues such as the social welfare or any other law, to accept it or reject it. You blamed everything on the private sector. I do not acquit it, but from your point of view as laborers, what have you done? Did you invite all your assemblies, General Assembly? No, to discuss. Thanks a lot. We will allow for interventions at the end of the discussion. My name is Yaqub Abu Asab. I am a former prisoner. I agree with Dr. Jihad mentioned that factions, they give analysis but not positions, although they should give positions. Not giving positions, this produces illusions for the people, confuses the public, like people, they don't know what are their limits. And this is one of the most things that what is mentioned, that people, they don't know about what you are asking them. And I'm giving you an example about this, about things that are happening due to ignorance. I am a Jerusalemite. During the first Intifada, I was living in Jerusalem. I understand the situation of Jerusalem and how the Jerusalemites consider the red lines. The issue of Israeli citizenship, it was criminalized publicly because there are clear Palestinian principles, be it for the Palestinian factions or the community leaders. As a result of non-clarity and haziness, there is a percentage of people who are applying for Israeli citizenship in Jerusalem under different pretexts, such as for housing or different issues, but they do not attribute that to the national dimension because no one is speaking to them from the national perspective. People are good, but they need leadership. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yaqub.
صباح الخير يعطيك العافية. مجدي أبو زيد.
Good morning, my name is Majdi Abu Zaid.
يعني أنا بدي أحكي بعض ملاحظات. أول شيء
Some comments.
مداخلتك يعني قوية.
Abu Majd, your intervention is clear and we haven't heard this since a long time, especially that you represent, as you said, you represent the marginalized and the oppressed, but to be realistic, we cannot blame, consider all the private sector as one. There are national bourgeoisie who suffered and oppressed, and now they have their national project and they paid the price for that, and there are agents for the settlers and for the occupation, and there are those who smuggle the products. The Israeli settlement dates used to be smuggled from the Israeli settlements and to be repacked, to be sent to the Turkish export quota as Palestinian product, and so we need to take care of this issue, take into consideration. One more thing. I have an issue that is related to the issue of loss of hope and depression among the public. It is attributed to different issues such as the internal issues as discussed by Jihad, Abu Majd, and yesterday speakers. All of these are reflected not only in the national project or the Palestinian leadership or faction, this is reflected as well on all the Palestinian institutions, including the civil society, University, because people started questioning and distancing themselves from all Palestinian institutions and all the Palestinian representation. This is a public state of affairs that requires to be addressed, and until now the tools of addressing it is not effective. There are no elections or democracy for the national project. There are unilateralism and the latest which yesterday's decision, the money is back and everything that was high up, we went down without any clarification or explanation. The issue of elections, my last comment, and the unions is extremely important. In Amman coalition, I would like to say that we are making a study on elections in Palestine and internal democratization and governance. We will issue a mapping, complete mapping for unions in Palestine, because we consider unions as extremely important, because the historical role and perhaps the future role of unions, these elections, as Mr. Ali mentioned, these were major leverage for the Palestinian project, and some action should be done on that for the future. And last thing, it's important to reconsider having this balance, as Abu Majd mentioned, which is the fair or just distribution to the resources and to the burdens as well.
مش ناس
for to ensure steadfastness and challenge. You cannot keep the resources on one side and the burdens on the other. Thank you, Mr. Majdi. Muhammad Jadallah, consultant for the General Union of Palestinian Unions, of Federation Palestinian Unions. Thank you, sir. I listened to the presentations. Speaking about unions, we don't have multinational companies, and so there should be a complete harmony in any way between the private sector, the government, and the unions. Because Palestine or the national liberation stage requires such positions from the unionist action. Certainly the political unionism is the alternative for the demands. So we are in a national liberation stage, so everything is a national economy. So in any way, there should be a harmony between the three production parties, laborers, employers, and the government, so that we can build. What Mr. Ali Mhanna mentioned is 100%, we know it. And the unions were the only resort for national struggle. And again, I say that we support that in any way. There should be harmony between the private sector and the public sector and the unions in order to build the homeland after the occupation. Thank you. Mr. Jamal. Since yesterday, the discussions are on the extreme edge of the issues, but they didn't delve deep to the root of the issue. So much that when speaking, either calling to unshackle ourselves from the agreements, which is a populist discourse, or speak about our inability to do anything. In spite of yesterday's intervention by Mr. Bassem Zubaydi, who accused all the elite, including the opposition, the civil society, as responsible for the crisis that we are having. And that this crisis cannot be addressed without taking out all this elite, and he asked how. In my view, the entry point to our current crisis is the denial that the Oslo Accords took us into a new stage that intervened with the past without making something new. So how to deal with the fault which Ali said today, that we couldn't defend ourselves nor the issues of the public. We have entered this and we were unable. We denied that the national liberation stage that is not completed, has not been completed, has entered a new stage, which is the democratization, which is or could be a condition for achieving the basic one, which is the national liberation. في هذا السياق أنا برأيي غابت أيضا فلسفة الحكومة ماذا نريد. The philosophy of the government, what we want, is absent as well. They marginalized the popular movement.
همش المجتمع الإسرائيلي
The people were marginalized, the Israeli society was marginalized, and the main mission was to appease the governing institution in Israel. The issue is not only coordination. All our previous policy was how to please and appease Clinton and the ruling Israeli elite, and then the public, we will deal with them later on. However, we deal with them. After the communist countries ended, we stopped having a relation with their peoples. If anyone who could
define the direct mission of the Palestinian people, even if they want to trigger the Palestinian people to engage again or re-engage again. And the main thing is how to strengthen the steadfastness of the Palestinian people against the colonization, including the redistribution of wealth and resources and responsibilities, and a management that can coordinate all of that. It's very important what you're saying, but it's clear the gist of what you are trying to say. Noor, the last speaker, and then two more questions, basically. So we will finish with these two questions in order to hear some concluding comments and remarks from the panelists. Noor, you have the floor. Thank you. Dr. Ali, what you said and what you mentioned in terms of this confusion between liberation and state building. But even in that analysis, we overlook the fact that the system itself, the regime, the ruling party and the opposition failed to build the human beings and redefining the role of Palestinian citizens in this confused stage in terms of the instruments, definitions, or the different roles that the main or different actors took upon themselves. This is the problem. It's not that we were not liberated, nor did we build. I think there was a process of building that was leading to concepts that relate to citizens and citizenship, but they were also confused and not very clear because our regime acted in general terms with the form or the idea of sponsorship or custody on what was existed and not was what happening, and that is what takes us to what Jihad has mentioned, and that is to lack of confidence or absence of confidence in the factions and the parties. But my question to Jihad, based on the affiliation to the political factions according to tribalism, do you think that there's an absence of any attempts to organize and recruit people and create a new situation that is practical, that rebels against the status quo, and that factions, the majority of whom are the young people who are also the majority of the Palestinian population, do they have the chance to do something that has an impact and take their or assume their role? I think we have a situation and we have people or young people outside this situation, and they are resentful and they are angry about this situation. They talk a lot about it, but this is where it ends and they do nothing about it. I think the question is very clear and we will wait for the answers. The last question. Hello, Saddam Al-Hroub. I wanted to address my question and remark to Dr. Jihad Harb. Dr. Jihad Harb talked about the failure of the Palestinian Liberation National Project, and we are always trying to work on this project in order to establish our Palestinian state. He talked about the role of the occupation and the Second Intifada and the monopoly of Fatah movement over the political decision. But where is the impact of the youth in this? Are we an obstacle in the national project? Do we have a role? We don't have a role. We stopped as young people. We are not doing anything. Who is responsible for that? We need to address this. Also, we talk about international solidarity with the Palestinian question. Then why can't we also understand the role of the world, the occupation and how it played the international solidarity with them? The media, why don't we work on the media and how do we promote our cause? And in the past, they said that they showed the occupation as being subjected to injustice, but we are the people who are falling under injustice. Why are we unable to convey our voices in a proper manner, and we raise our voices instead of having different tools and instruments? And that is the responsibility of the Palestinian media, those who are officials, professors, academics. The Palestinian youth are absent from this scene. Palestinian youth are now running after making a living, of getting married, of having a family. Where are we? And we are a main cornerstone in the national project. The national project will not continue if we are not part of it. As young people, Mr. Mahmoud, you talked about social welfare. As an MA student in law, we don't have a legal culture among the people in the streets. I studied in Jordan, and I continue my studies in Jordan. And the people, Palestinian people, do not know their rights, do not know what their rights are. The Palestinian workers do not know that there's a labor law. And all respect to Mr. Ali Mahana, because he gave a presentation that was really very interesting. I thank all those who ask questions.
بس استنى الميكروفون ونختتم بالأستاذ حربي دلال. تفضل.
Hello everyone. I have a direct question. Is the problem in diagnosing the political, economic and social conditions of the Palestinian society as a whole? I heard the presentations, I heard everything. Where does the problem lie? Does it lie in the fact that there's no intention to solve the problem or inability to solve the problem? And who benefits from the lack of a solution? This is a clear question, but do you expect an answer to that question, really? Most of what we've heard are comments and remarks that were very healthy. That's very healthy, and the questions are limited, and it's also healthy. We go back to the panelists, because the speakers, when they make their presentations that are clear and that are complete, this reduces the need for questions, but rather have comments and solicit comments to enrich the discussion. It means that the panelists did a very good job in their presentations. So we give 3 minutes to the 3 panelists if they want to answer and address the questions that were addressed to them. Sorry. We start with Jihad Harb. 3 minutes, please. Most of the questions were directed at me, Dr. Abdullah. I said that from among the 50% who object the two-state solution, 31% of them talk about the one-state solution. In the surveys, we don't ask about many of the concepts, but we ask the public about the events. There's a new trend among the Palestinian people that is now demanding a one-state solution. These represent almost 13 to 15% of the Palestinian public. In terms of the ideas of regrouping and coming together, you know that the dialogue among the left-wing parties from the 70s, they were unable to come together and establish one front, and the last such experience was the Democratic Coalition that also failed. This is a difficulty, and this is not part of the paper. The paper is about the positions of the Palestinian factions on the different questions that are presented before them today. So I don't think this is part of the paper. Maybe it's another paper or another research that we could look at, and maybe Dr. Muder should pay attention to that in the next conference. We don't have a plan B. We worked since Oslo until this day. We combined 2 phases: the liberation stage, the national liberation, and also the class struggle. There was none among the Palestinian elites that created a plan B. for if something failed. Noor, of course, I don't have, nor anyone probably has a prescription or a recipe or a prediction of what is going to happen tomorrow with the Palestinian factions, but the people are looking for something new. This disregard, this separation from the people now are looking for something new, maybe a new framework, a new situation. We saw in the Arab world major transformations, and you've noticed, for example, in the Tunisian elections, Qais Said becomes the first candidate, the prime candidate among the candidates of other political factions. There, people were fed up with the political parties because of their failures and incapacities. We learn from the people's experiences and other experiences. Mr. Harbi, I'm sorry that I didn't answer all the questions, but Mr. Harbi, it's true that we do a diagnosis and a description, and if you go to Muwatin's exhibition outside, you will see a discussion about the crisis of the political factions and the problems that we are facing. That was discussed in the 1998 conference. We are able to diagnose and analyze and describe, but we don't know how to interpret or analyze, and we don't have, just like the other political factions. The political factions should give us positions and actions, but they give us analysis, and that is sad. There is no ability to make actions among those people who have the instruments of or ability to make the change. So tomorrow, to answer Noor, we don't know where the explosion will come from or where the change will come from. Mr. Mahmoud, 3 minutes. Thank you very much. I agree fully that the priority is to strengthen steadfastness. But what do we mean by strengthening steadfastness? The steadfastness of whom, and who's going to be strengthened in that regard? Just to be very brief, if we don't recognize humanity and the dignity of the people, there will be no steadfastness nor a national project. To recognize them as human beings, as citizens that who have rights. What does that mean? That they should be able to live like humans. What does that mean is to share responsibilities. How do we do sharing responsibilities? That the situation is bad, that the private sector should pay money. They should pay taxes, not for the government to do tax exemptions or reduce the tax brackets from 5% to 3% and do investment promotion and investment incentives. This is empty talk. How do we do that? We need democracy. What do I mean by democracy? There's a balance of powers. How do we do that? Very briefly, all those who are supportive of the national project and dignity, justice, and the right, and those who want to get rid of colonization should carry out an intifada, an uprising, so that we reach the point of balance. An intifada not to destroy everything, but for us to become human beings and have dignity and have rights. This will not happen just by talking, without action, without rallies and demonstrations, and for people to be mobilized, those who want to get rid of colonization. We will never get rid of colonization without recognizing the humanity of each one. You should recognize that I'm a human being. The PA and the private sector do not recognize the humanity of the Palestinian citizens, neither here nor at the Yarmouk refugee camp or in the Lebanese refugee camps. Look and read and pay attention. The intifada in Lebanon of the refugee camps, it was not carried out by the PLO nor by the Palestinian factions. The PLO and the Palestinian factions just followed the people. But look at what happened in terms of the social welfare movements and the protests. The Palestinian factions had nothing to do with it. Pay attention to all of that. All those who are revolutionary, the leftists, the nationalists, and those who want to get rid of the colonization should say that talking is not sufficient, and that we all Palestinians are human beings, and that now the PA and the private sector should prove in practice on the basis of sharing responsibility that they are Palestinians and they are really nationalists and that they have an interest in getting rid of colonization. Emancipation from colonization cannot happen except through the recognition of the dignity of Palestinian people. Thank you, Mahmoud. Mr. Ali Mhanna. Mr. Ali, if you allow me, I had one question about your presentation. I will take the opportunity as a moderator just to pose this question to you. It is between the unionist performance currently under the PA and the union performance before. I think the main difference is elections. I was the person living in the phase pre the PA. I think the unions had elections and the elections were real. And maybe this is one of the reasons why that made these unions really able to reflect the interests of their constituents and have strong constituencies, whereas after the PA there were no elections. Either they are not happening or that a number of factions do the sharing of the quotas and do a joint list at the account of real elections. And I think maybe this is another factor that weakened the unionism in Palestine. But I leave it to you to answer that. Since the establishment of the PA, there was an important question. Maybe it wasn't discussed as much as now. Can we build a state under occupation or not? This was the key word the key question. Can we build a state under occupation or not? This answers many of the questions that were posed. The second question that was posed all the time, and maybe Jamal remembers that, can the realization of or building a state, would it contribute towards ending the colonization? So it is the reverse question. So if we complete the building process, would that contribute or accelerate the process of ending colonization? Under the governments, the previous governments, maybe under Salam Fayyad government, there was a focus on that, and I think Dr. Ghassan Khatib was a member in that government. Building the human beings, Noor, is based on what we want out of these people, so that we can build their capacities towards that. We don't know what are the tasks that are required of the Palestinian people. So we need to agree what do we want from the Palestinians, and then we can build their capacities towards that. What is needed now, I think what is needed now is to retune our pace to respond to the needs of liberation on the one side, and to continue the process of building within the objectives of also strengthening steadfastness. If we do not rebalance our understanding of these two functions, we will not succeed.
Thanks a lot for the speakers, and I hope that this session could have contributed to answering your questions. Thank you. Thank you.